Good evening, and welcome to Kelly's Corner. I'm glad you're here. Welcome back. I've been meaning to sit down and record this episode for a couple of days now, but one thing or another has gotten in the way, and it's been kind of a busy and hectic week, so I just haven't had the time. And truth be told, I probably should have recorded this episode last weekend, but with Easter and the Holy Week, I wanted to take time to recognize and to talk about that. And to be quite honest, I meant to record this episode early in the week, and work and life got in the way and kind of pushed it back. But as they say, better late than never, I guess. A friend of mine told me a few weeks ago that I needed to record an episode talking about this, and I told her that I would, and I had no intention of putting it off this long, but things happen, life happens. And I guess there's no better day than today to talk about it. Something you may or may not know, or if you do know, you may or may not be aware or have taken the time to consider it. But on April the 18th of this year, it was the 250th anniversary of what we know to be Paul Revere's ride. On April the 18th of 1775, Dr. Joseph Warren summoned Paul Revere and told him that he needed to ride to Lexington and warn specifically Samuel Adams and John Hancock that the British were about to march. The British soldiers were coming, and they were coming specifically to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock. And if they found them, they would undoubtedly be tried, found guilty of treason, and ultimately hanged. And the colonists, Joseph Warren and those who were sympathetic to the colonists, did not want that to happen, because if it did, it's in all likelihood would have put a hurt on the colonists' cause, because Samuel Adams and John Hancock were two prominent people behind the push for liberty and for freedom from Great Britain. So he warned them that he sent Paul Revere ahead to warn John Hancock and Samuel Adams. The tip that Dr. Joseph Warren received, in all likelihood, probably came from General Thomas Gage, who was the British general responsible for Boston. It probably came from his wife. She probably gave him a little tip, because there were feelings that she might be a little sympathetic to the colonists' plight and to the colonists' cause, and that the tip might have come from her. Although I don't know that there's any historical evidence that that's the case. If you've ever seen the miniseries that the History Channel did a couple of years ago, that points to Thomas Gage's wife being the person who tipped off the colonists of this. And so the colonists had devised a plan to help kind of notify one another in Boston if when the British were about to march. And Paul Revere, before he left to go to Lexington to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, he told his friend, and there's some speculation as to who actually is the friend that did it, who he informed, but he told one of his friends to go up to the tower of the Old North Church and to hang 2 lanterns in the tower. And that was their signal that they had agreed upon. They were going to hang 1 lantern if the British were going to come by land, and they were going to hang 2 lanterns if the British were going to come by sea. And so he told his friend to go hang 2 lanterns that night, and he set off. Now, history teaches, for whatever reason, they make it seem like that Paul Revere was the only rider that night. And that's just not the case. In fact, it's far from the truth. In fact, there were several riders that night. The 3 most notable were Paul Revere, a man by the name of William Dawes, and Samuel Prescott. They also rode routes, but there were dozens of other people who helped warn the colonists of the British march as well. All 3 would ultimately be detained, but they were all eventually let go, I believe. And then something else leading after that, we get to Lexington on April the 19th of 1775. The local militia, Minutemen, as they were called, because they were supposed to be ready to fight on a minute's notice, came out of Buckman's Tavern, which was adjacent to the Lexington Common, or the Lexington Battle Green, as it's also known, and they formed two rows of their troops, and they faced the British troops there on the Lexington Common, and someone opened fire, and the militia, led by John Parker, suffered the first casualties of the American Revolution. The army in Concord, Massachusetts, not too far from Lexington, attempted to secure the North Bridge that crossed the Concord River. But as they were attempting to do that, the British opened fire, and they killed some colonists who returned fire and killed some British. And this incident in Concord is what became known as the shot heard around the world. And when the Americans fired on the British and some of the British people were killed, the British turned and retreated. Now, I took a trip to Boston in 2017, and on my trip I spent about a day, maybe a little less, in Lexington and Concord, and I took a bus tour called the Liberty Ride. Very good and a very informative bus tour. One of the better ones I've ever taken, actually. And being a student of history, I thought, they're just going to tell me a bunch of stuff that I already knew. And yeah, it's going to be cool to see all these places. And it was very cool to stand on the Lexington Battle Green where the first shots took place. And yeah, it was very cool to stand on the Concord, the North Bridge over the Concord River and watch the water flow. And it was cool to stand in the gift shop there at right next door to the Buckman's Tavern and stand with a Minuteman and get my picture made. That was all great and cool. But I thought, what am I really going to learn that I don't already know? Well, I was surprised because I did learn a few things on that trip, especially on the Liberty Ride. And one of the things I learned, I had always heard all of my life, even through college and college history courses, that nobody really knows who fired the shot heard around the world. Nobody really knows whose gun that came from. And no, we don't specifically know a soldier's name to say this person did it. But as they stated on the Liberty Ride, if you think about it, we do know which side the shot heard around the world came from. Because at this time, the colonists, even though they were fighting for their freedom from the British, were still British citizens, every single one of them. They were still British subjects, all born British. That was their nationality. That was what they were born. And so when they fired on the British soldiers, they were committing treason against the British Crown. 100%, firing against their own people. So it is said on the Liberty Ride, they explain that is why they believe that the colonists were the ones to fire the, quote, shot heard around the world, because they were firing on their own people. They were firing on the fellow British. They weren't, I guess they were technically American at that time, because they were in the Americas, but they were still British citizens. Now, they wanted to not be British citizens, but they had not gained independence yet. And so they were still subject to British authority. And so they were firing against their own. Very similarly, I guess, to what the South did in the Civil War. Maybe a little bit different, but still similar. But anyway, as the British retreat back across the North Bridge, heading back toward Lexington, when they get back to Lexington, they find the colonists there on the battle green, and the colonists fire on the British regulars. And they fire on them from behind cover. They're hiding behind rocks and trees and buildings and anything they can find to protect themselves. And the whole way from Concord to Lexington, the British soldiers are being fired upon. The whole route. And they're continually being ambushed by the Minutemen. And at some point, I'm sure, in those 12 miles, they realized that these people are not going to go down quietly, and they're quite literally not going to go down without a fight. And the Minutemen pursued them. They didn't give up. And once they got to Lexington, they continued to push them back. They didn't let them just stop and get away. They pursued them all the way back to Boston. And in the Battle of Lexington and Concord that day, the British suffered 300 casualties. The Americans, or the colonists, only suffered 93. And as a result of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, General Gage finds that Boston has a huge militia of men that he had no idea about, and that all throughout New England, those numbers had been bolstered, because when they got word that the British were marching on Boston and Lexington and Concord, and we're about to have a war, boys, people all throughout New England joined the cause. And so, because they realized that, yeah, this might be affecting Boston now, but if it's affecting Boston now, it's eventually going to trickle down to us. And it's eventually going to come to New Hampshire. And it's eventually going to come to Rhode Island and Pennsylvania and Virginia and North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia and all of the other colonies. It's eventually going to get there. If they can do this in Boston, they're going to start doing this everywhere. And they wanted to do something. They wanted to help their fellow colonists, the people that they were fighting for their cause. So they get back to Boston, and General Gage discovers that there's people from all over New England that have come to help. And there's 20,000 men. 20,000 men have gathered in Boston to help the colonists fight the British. And this is what becomes known as the Continental Army. And something that I thought was cool, and I guess I'd never really thought about it until I took the Liberty ride. But we think of now, if the Army gets sent off to somewhere to fight a battle, it's Army men who are trained in military tactics and warfare and who are trained to fight. The people that fought at Lexington and Concord, and I guess probably for most, if not all, of the Revolutionary War, weren't all military men. Most of them. In fact, all of them at Lexington and Concord were farmers and tradesmen, doctors, lawyers, people like that. People who believed in the cause of freedom and believed in that cause enough to fight for it. Now, not all of the people in America were on the colonist side. There were some British loyalists, but by and large, the people in the colonies wanted their freedom from Britain. They wanted to form a quote, more perfect union. And on that day in 1775, the Lexington militia, they didn't intend to fight the regulars that day. They didn't intend to start the Revolutionary War and to fight for freedom. In fact, that particular day, the British didn't intend to necessarily fight anybody, really. Thomas Gage's main goal for sending the army to Lexington and Concord was literally to capture two men, Samuel Adams and John Hancock. That was his goal. That he wanted to capture them, and he wanted to get all of the arms that they had and the weapons that they had secured. I don't know that anybody intended that day for there to be a war with the impact that it ended up having. But it did. Something else I wanted to mention that I learned on the Liberty Ride, and I guess I should have mentioned it at the beginning, when I was talking about Paul Revere, was that, history always teaches, I'd been taught from elementary school all the way up through college, that, when Paul Revere rode, he rode through the streets of Massachusetts, from Boston to Lexington and wherever, saying the British are coming, the British are coming, the British are coming. Well, that's not the truth, because the truth of the matter is Paul Revere wouldn't have said that. And here's why. Paul Revere would not have said the British are coming because, as I pointed to earlier, Paul Revere himself was British. What history believes, at least the Lexington Ride or the Liberty Ride pointed out, and I do think rightfully so, something more along the lines of what he would have said would have been the regulars, which is the British Army. The army was called the British Regulars. The regulars are on the move. It doesn't quite have the same ring to it, but it's probably closer to what he actually said, other than the British are coming. I do believe he probably said something closer to the regulars are on the move, the regulars are on the march. But where it's his famous saying, I think, kind of became famous, was in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Paul Revere's Ride poem that he wrote several years after Paul Revere wrote into history. Like I said, there were many others that rode with him. And why Paul Revere is the one that gets all of the notoriety, I don't know. But he does. And that's just a point of history. But there are others that, deserve credit as well. Because had they not been notified, the history as we know it would have undoubtedly been completely different. That's about all I have to say about that. Obviously, those are two of the most famous battles of the American Revolution. I'm not going to, go into detail on every single battle of the Revolution. That would be nearly impossible. But 250 years ago, this past week, the Revolution started, and it carried on for many years. I think we all probably know that in 2026, America will, celebrate its 250th anniversary. And the war waged on beyond that as well. A lot of people might think that the American Revolution ended on July 4th, 1776, and that's just not the case. We declared our independence on that day, but the war continued on for several years beyond that. But independence all started at Lexington and Concord. And I think we owe a lot of that to those who were willing to risk their lives to warn, to let them know. People like suspected General Gage's wife. She could have gotten in some serious trouble, or whomever was the person who gave the tip to Dr. Joseph Warren, whoever it was. And then, Paul Revere and his writers, they could have gotten into some serious trouble as well. And, there were people in the Revolutionary War who were, in fact, arrested and tried and hanged for being a spy. And for, you think of a spy in the Revolutionary War, you think of Benedict Arnold. He's the first one that comes to mind. But there was somebody that was working with Benedict Arnold by the name of John Andre. And in the whole Benedict Arnold situation, they were both captured. John Andre was captured. And George Washington said, I will switch Andre out if you give me Benedict Arnold. I'll let Andre live. And the British would not allow that to happen. And because they didn't allow that to happen, John Andre was hanged for treason. And Nathan Hale was another that was hanged for treason. He was only in his early 20s. I believe he was 21. There's a lot of interesting stories in the Revolution, and history in general, not just the Revolution, but history in general. But I've rambled on long enough about this. Did also want to mention that yesterday, April 24th, I know you guys know that I like the Oak Ridge Boys. Yesterday, April 24th, was the best bass singer in the world, Richard Sterban's 82nd birthday. Let's wish him a happy birthday. Hope he had a great day. And wish them safe travels as they travel to Oklahoma this weekend. But anyway, I've rambled on long enough and probably bored you to tears. If anyone is still listening, thank you. And I hope you all have a great weekend. Have a great night. Stay safe. And I'll talk to you next time. See ya.